Hey everyone, it's Zeke. Welcome back to another video. Before you get into this, make sure to leave a thumbs up, and if you're new here, consider subscribing. Alright, so in this video, I'm going to go over everything you need to know about buying a mining rig in 2022. I'll be diving into each specific part and area of mining so that you know what you're doing before dropping a big pile of cash on an expensive mining rig, because prices are crazy right now with scalpers and supply shortages. So you'll be spending around double the amount you would normally be spending on a mining rig compared to the earlier days. So you want to make sure that you're putting your money towards the right gear, as the current outlook for making your money back from mining is over a year. So first things first, the main part of your mining rig is of course the graphics cards. These are really important because the graphics cards you're running determines how much you'll be making. I made a video on 5 things you need to know before buying a GPU, so I recommend you check that out before watching the rest of this video. But to summarize the video, I just said that you should not buy the older GPUs because they're really overpriced and they won't really hold their value that much because they won't be good to mine with in the future. So you want a newer GPU like a 20 or 30 series NVIDIA card. Even though these are really overpriced still, these cards are really good at mining and will still be good in a few years from now. A few other things I said in that video are that it might just be better to buy GPUs now instead of waiting for ETH 2.0 because it may never happen this year. So why miss out on all the Ethereum mining while it's still here, you know? And then buy a GPU that has some resellability so that if you can't make your money from mining with it, then you know you could always resell it and make some money back from it. There's a few other things I talk about in that video, but these are the most important things. So yeah, let's get on to the rest of the video. But before we start, I just want to say that you should spend the majority of your money on the GPUs and then try to get the cheapest possible parts you can for the rest of the rig. This is because these other parts don't actually make you any money. It's only the GPUs that do. Think about it this way: a GPU costs $2,000 and makes you $5 a day, for example. Now that's really good, but in order to have that GPU running, you need to spend like an additional $1,000, which means you're making $5 a day to pay off a $3,000 rig instead of just a $2,000 graphics card. So that's why you want to get like the cheapest parts possible so you can break even on all your mining rig as fast as possible. And if mining ever becomes unprofitable, then the only thing that will really still be valuable in your rig is the graphics cards, and the rest of the parts will depreciate a lot more. So alright, so now let's get into the components of the mining rig. So the CPU. Now, this is basically what processes all the information on your mining rig. I'm sure you know what a CPU is, but basically the power, like how good your CPU will not affect how well your GPU's mine. Doesn't really affect it that much. And because of that, you should just go with the cheapest possible CPU that you can find that will fit a motherboard you can find. So yeah, you could find like a $10 CPU from like the 2005 or really old or something, but if you can't find a motherboard that will support it, then there's no point. So just find a cheap CPU that's not too old, and you can also find a motherboard for it. Another thing is you can find a CPU with integrated graphics if you want to plug in a display into your mining rig, because it's probably not a good idea to plug a display into your GPU while it's mining because that can affect some of the performance or hash rate. So yeah, you can get an integrated graphics CPU and then plug a monitor right into your rig so you can monitor it as it's mining. But yeah, the CPU won't really be used much by the mining rig and like the mining software, so you don't really need to cool it down that much. So you can use like the stock heatsink that comes with the CPU, or if it doesn't come with one, if you're buying secondhand, then you can just get a cheap one because the CPU cooler doesn't really matter in a mining rig. The only thing you do want to consider is that you don't want the CPU cooler to be too tall because it might not fit in the mining rig. But yeah, that's basically it about CPUs. As for the RAM, it's pretty simple. Windows needs at least 8 GB of RAM, and then Linux, like HiveOS, needs 4 GB. So yeah, if you're going to be mining on Windows, get 8 GB. If you're mining on Linux, then get 4 GB. Other than that, there's really not much you need to know about RAM. Like the RAM speed doesn't really matter. You can get 2666 megahertz. You don't need to go with something crazy like 3000 megahertz or 4000 megahertz or DDR5 RAM. It's really up to you. If your motherboard has DDR3 RAM, then make sure it has DDR3 RAM in your computer. So yeah, that's all you really need to know about RAM. And then the third thing is the motherboard. So this is important because it's basically the brain of your rig. If the motherboard isn't good, then you're gonna have lots of problems with setting up all your GPUs. And you've probably seen those mining motherboards that have like tons of PCI Express slots. These are really overpriced right now. And also the server motherboards that have like, it's like a big long rectangle that has a bunch of Pci X16 slots. Normal gaming motherboards just have like 1 or 2 PCIe 16X slots and then some couple of 1X slots. Most of these ATX motherboards can normally support like 5 to 7 GPUs, depends on it. But yeah, make sure your motherboard supports your CPU like I said earlier. So if you have like LGA 1200, get an LGA 1200 CPU. If it's LGA 1151, make sure it's an LGA 1151 CPU. I made this mistake one time, it was not fun. And then if you have AMD, I think they're mostly AM4 slots. So yeah, just check your specifications, use PC part picker and put your motherboard and CPU together and see if they match. And then yeah, so Pcie X16 slots, these are the big long ones that a normal GPU fits into in a gaming PC. However, you can use the Pcie X1 slots for mining. Now normally in gaming PCs, the GPUs just plug into the first X16 slot on the motherboard, which is the big one, but in mining rigs you can use both of these together. So with these little tiny Pcie X slots, you plug into what's called GPU risers into the motherboard. Now this basically takes the 1X slot, puts it into a USB 3 cable, and then you can plug into a motherboard with this big GPU riser. Hopefully that makes sense. It basically just takes a little smaller slot on the motherboard that's capable of running a GPU and then expanding it into a slot that the GPU can actually plug into. And also, if you don't have enough PCI slots on your motherboard, you can get these Pci Splitters that takes one of these 1X slots or a 16X slot and splits it into 4 connections. Now these are really good. And you can also get these adapters for M.2 slots, which basically takes the M.2 slot and changes it into PCI Express if you want to fit more GPUs onto your motherboard. Now just one thing to know is that most motherboards, you know, from like the past 5 years, should be able to handle 7 to 12 GPUs, but it really depends on like the chipset and how good the motherboard is. So that is one thing you need to note. You should be able to run a lot of GPUs on your motherboard if you tweak the BIOS settings properly, but you might run into a little bit of issues. Also, if you're running only a couple of GPUs, it might be a good idea to get a micro ATX motherboard because these are less expensive and you're only going to be running like 3 to 4 GPUs on anyway, so this could be a good option for you. But if you're running a bunch of GPUs, like, you know, more than 7, then definitely get an ATX motherboard. There's also other variations of motherboards like eATX. Now you could get these, they're probably pretty expensive, but maybe do you want to get them. Just one thing you need to know is that you have to make sure the frame you're buying fits these motherboards. Anyways, onto the GPU risers. These are what I explained a little bit earlier, but they're an important component because this is what your GPU connects to your motherboard. And I believe that you should avoid cheap ones because these could fail down the line and then you're not mining anymore. So you know, you could go with a little bit more expensive ones. Most of them are pretty good, but just don't go for like really cheap ones because that may cause you problems. And then as for the power supply, these are really important because it's always different for the kind of GPUs you're running. Like each mining rig has different power supplies depending on what cards they're running, and it's set up specifically for the GPUs you're running. So to calculate the Psu wattage you're going to need for your mining rig, you basically take the TDP, which is the thermal design power of all the GPUs that you're going to be running, and you can find this just by looking on Google and then adding them all together. And you take that wattage of all the GPUs, add it up, and then add an extra 150 watts or so to the calculation, and then multiply this by 125 watts. And this will give you the total amount of power supply wattage you're going to need in your system. So for example, if you have 6 3060 Ti's with a TDP of 200 watts each, and then you add 150 watts to that, multiply it by 1.25, you'll get 1700 watts. So that means you're going to need a 1700 watt power supply, and you're going to be using 80% of that total. Now, you've probably heard about the 80% rule. You want to only be using 80% of the total power supply wattage just to ensure safety. Now, I made a video on how to safely power your mining rig, so I'd recommend you watch this because this is what I go over in that. It just ensures efficiency and safety, and it's really important to have the right power supply wattage for your mining rig because whatever happens, if your cards start running at maximum power, you'll still be able to handle all of that power. And you don't just want to set up your mining rig for, you know, Ethereum, because Ethereum has a pretty low wattage for most GPUs, and then if you have to switch to like Ravencoin or Flux, you're going to be mining at like almost full capacity what your cards can handle. So you want to make sure that your power supply wattage can safely handle 80% of the max of all the GPUs, so whatever happens, whatever coin you have to mine, you'll still be able to mine those efficiently and safely. A few of the things about power supplies is that modular ones are always better because it saves the hassle with cables. And then you can also get 2 power supplies instead of just one massive one because this can save you a bit of money. You just have to make sure that your mining frame can handle 2 power supplies. And then if you have 2 power supplies, you're going to need a 24-pin splitter cable to make the motherboard connectable to these power supplies. And then make sure your power supply has enough PCIe power cables to power your GPUs. Now, you don't want to cheap out on the power supply. Get a good one, like one from EVGA. So I'd say like the cheapest things you can buy in your mining rig is, you know, CPU, RAM, maybe motherboard, and then go for a decent frame, GPU riser, and power supply, because these are important components. And then, you know, watch my video on how to safely power mining rig, because I go over a lot of important things in that video, and after that you should be able to have confidence in powering your mining rig safe. So almost done with this video. The second last thing is the frame. So you can either build one yourself if you know how to build things, or you can buy a pre-built one. Now these are pretty expensive right now because, you know, popularity for them is pretty high, but some considerations you want to make before buying one is that you want to see how many power supplies it can hold, hold. So if you're running like 2 power supplies because it's cheaper and more and sometimes better, just make sure that your frame can handle 2 power supplies, because you don't want to have one just hanging around somewhere on the rig. So, and then another thing is how much airflow does it allow for your cards, and then is it durable, how many GPUs does it support. These are just some things you need to know before buying one. All the frame really does is hold everything together, but you know, you still want to make sure that your GPUs aren't too close together, because they can get pretty hot. I made this mistake before. Like, there's some frames that say they can hold 12 GPUs, which they can, but there's barely any space in between them. So, you know, look at pictures of the rig, watch some videos on people using them, just to see how they are set up, kind of. And the last thing is storage. So if you're using like Linux or Hive OS, then you can just use a simple USB stick with like 8 or 16 gigabytes on it. Now this is less stable than an actual hard drive, but it's pretty cheap and easy. So if you have like lots of mining rigs, then you could just have USB sticks only in it. But most commonly people use is SSDs, which are, you know, decently cheap. They work for Windows and Hive OS. They're really fast for booting up your computer. And it also doesn't take up an M.2 slot on your mining rig, because that can be used for putting an extra GPU on your motherboard. And then there's M.2 slots. These are a little bit more expensive. They work for Windows and Hive OS, but they do take up one of the M.2 slots that could have otherwise been used as a GPU riser, and they are much faster than SSDs, so some people like them for gaming PCs as well. And then hard drives, these are probably like the cheapest option because they work for Windows and Hive OS, but they're a lot slower than an M.2 and SSD, so if you want your mining rig to boot up faster and transfer files faster, then maybe avoid one of these and go with an SSD or something. Yeah, anyways, that's mostly what you need to know about how to build a mining rig. If any questions you have, comment down below. I should be able to help you out. And I hope I went over everything in detail for you so that you can have more knowledge when you're coming into buying a mining rig. But yeah, that's going to do it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.